Yes, welcome everybody to Orkney Viking Week and our special guest tonight, the author Lexie Conyngham. And Lexie is an archivist and historian who lives in Aberdeen. She's also a creative writer, so she's the author of this book series, the Orkneyinga murder series. I first met Lexie in 2018 when she was up here taking part in a Viking walking tour event that I organized then, and she was telling me all about her book, which this first one in the series came out in 2018, and since that time she's followed up with two more. So the first one is Tomb for an Eagle, then we have Wolf at the Gate. Book 3, Dragon in the Snow. I've not seen it yet, but I'm a bit behind the curve there, I see, because now book 4 is just about to come out too. So tonight we're going to have the special treat of hearing from Lexie, and she has promised to read a little bit from book 4, which has not yet come out but will be coming soon. So I'm really looking forward to that. Those of you who were with us earlier today also saw some of the places where the book is set. So this Tomb from an Eagle starts with Thorphin the Mighty, and earlier today some of us visited his home out in Bershey. So I think it's nice when history and fiction connect like that, and the fiction brings these people alive to us. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Lexie Conyngham. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Raggy. I am delighted to be taking part in the second Orkney Viking Week, although week's a sketchy term, and this one's 10 days long, I think. I really enjoyed the first one, and I hope these will be the first two of many. I'm only sorry I can't be in Orkney in person this year, but as we're all native Zoom dwellers now, I'm sure this will be just the same. A few years ago, my mother was moving house, and a neighbour came to say goodbye. "This is my daughter," said my mother, who's always my best publicist. "She writes books, you know." And the man said, "Oh, what kind?" And I said, "Oh, historical crime fiction." "Ooh, do you do Vikings?" he asked eagerly. "I love Vikings." I explained that no, I didn't do Vikings. I did nice genteel Georgians and early Victorians, and I wondered how you could possibly write Viking crime fiction. But the idea sort of lingered. And that summer we went to York, and we went to the Jorvik Centre. I hadn't been there before. And I began to think about Viking crime fiction and where, should anyone be mad enough to write such a thing, it might be set. Well, York seemed an obvious opportunity, maybe, but it's a fair distance from Aberdeen, which is where I live. Norway, we've got friends there, good excuse to visit them. But at that time, my Norwegian was even more sketchy than it is now. And so I gave it a bit more thought, couldn't quite decide. Then I happened to make contact again with an old friend of mine from university who works in Kirkwall, and Orkney sprang to mind. Just a ferry trip or a flight from Aberdeen, somehow so much easier than York or Bergen, and I've always loved Orkney. So there we were, and despite myself, I began to do my research. I hadn't realised, having spent a great deal of time in archives and around Georgian buildings over the years, just how much information I'd simply absorbed about the Georgian period without really trying. Viking history and Viking culture was a completely new subject for me. For several months, I read about it. I think Judith Jesch's Women in the Viking Age was one of the first books I acquired, so it was great to be able to attend her talk on the Orkneyinga saga last week. I visited Viking sites, I devoured archaeological reports, pressed my nose against glass cases in museums, read myths and sagas. I attended a university course called Vikings! I collected Pinterest images and then tried to work out which of them were well-researched costumes and which of them were just Fantasyland. I learned tablet weaving, and then I learned and promptly forgot nail binding as well. I tried my hand at skaldic verse, and I went Viking hiking across Hoy with Raggy and her crew. And I'm still, after all that, nowhere near as competent in the subject as I would like to be. There's always another book to read and another site to visit and Old Norse to learn when I finally got my head around Norwegian. So anyway, having decided where to set the books, I then had to choose when. The where, in the end, influenced the when. If I was going to be in Orkney, then why not choose the time when Orkney was, to my mind, the very centre of all Viking comings and goings? The Earldom of Thorphin Sigurdsson, Thorfinn the Mighty, the point where the old faith tips into Christianity, the peak of Orkney Viking power. I saw Thorfinn as somebody who was scarred by his own killing of his nephew, Ronvald Brusason. And I also saw him as someone who was changing the culture of his world, not only moving from being Christian politically, as his father had been, to being a Christian by conviction, but also as somebody settling down to law-giving, tax-raising, an almost domestic existence in the islands that was very far from the raging of previous generations. And how would his followers react to all that? Because crime fiction is by its nature set in conflict, it's liminal, it's transgressional. And I could find all that around 1050, based in Bercy. I have to say, geographically, I've taken a minor liberty with the Broch of Bercy. These days, I don't know if all of you know it, but it's accessible at the appropriate tide. And Barbara Crawford, amongst others, has postulated the loss of a chunk of Thorfinn's settlement into the sea when the peninsula became effectively an island. And I've reinstated that tongue of land. It's given Thorfinn a slightly bigger settlement, and anyway, why be a writer if you can't make things up? I must say I have thoroughly enjoyed all this work. I brought out Tim for an Eagle, as Raggy said, in 2018, and it's now available as an audiobook too, read by the incomparable Ulf Bjorklund. And as Raggy says, I'm now writing the fourth, and I can't quite believe that. An important thing when you're starting a crime fiction series is to find a good detective or team of detectives. Clearly, this was not going to be a police procedural, but I could invent someone acting with Thorfinn's authority, a straight-laced, rather stern and competent warrior, Ketil Gunnarsson. And just to annoy him, I gave him a childhood friend who also, by chance, came to Orkney, Sigrid, Harold's daughter, a widow in mourning, trying to support herself on her small farm by working in wool. I wanted to show how much travel was taken for granted by the Vikings. Sigrid and Ketil were both born in Hetherbir on the Danish border. They're children of Norwegian traders. Ketil has travelled extensively, and even Sigrid has lived in Norway and Caithness. In the second book, there are visitors from Iceland and from Cologne in Germany, while in the third book, one of the main characters has possessions that he's brought back from Miklagarth, which is now Istanbul. Sigrid's neighbour, Helga, buys goods from all over the world in the harbour below the Broch. Tosti, Thorfinn's priest, is Danish, but he's also been to Rome. But I'm afraid Ketil doesn't initially at least warm to Orkney. He's used to travelling and he doesn't like staying too long in one place, and he thinks the islands are far too flat anyway. I'll read a bit now, if I may. This is near the beginning of the third book, Dragon in the Snow, which is mostly set on Shappensea. When I was there a couple of years ago, I came across the text of a talk which said that Shappensea was not mentioned in the Orkneyinga saga, and it had been speculated for years that the Vikings just hadn't bothered with Shappensea, which is really unlikely because it's a good, fertile, accessible island. Why would they not have bothered with it? The person who'd written the talk, Louise Hollenrake, had then gone on to map all the Viking place names that occur on Shappensea and show that it was pretty clear the Vikings had been there, but that nothing had ever happened on Shappensea. Again, the writer's mind is tempted. I decided it might be fun to make something happen on Shappensea, and so Dragon in the Snow was begun. I also took inspiration from Ward Hill and the beacon trails that once linked the further islands to, presumably to Bercy or wherever the seat of power was at any particular time. If Shappensea needed to call for help urgently, lighting the beacon at the top of Ward Hill would be the thing to do. This linked in with a paper I was lucky enough to find at Bercy Books, great secondhand bookshop. And the book was by Alfred Johnson, written in 1915. I think he was also referenced by Nicholas Frenzel the other day. It was a book on fire raising in Viking Orkney, and fires lit in my mind and the plot began to take shape. So I say this is from near the beginning. Ketil Gunnarsson, warrior and general agent for Thorfinn Sigurdsson, was indeed at the Broch, but he did not feel safe at all. In fact, he was doing his best to avoid Thorphin. It was true he was growing more accustomed to the islands and their eccentricities, both the land and the people. It seemed he was going to have to tolerate them anyway. When he'd first worked for Thorfinn, he had barely stayed a few months in the same place. Thorfinn's earldom extended from Hjaltland in the north down to Whitby, when they could keep the locals quiet, in the south, taking in parts of Fife, most of Caithness, and reaching round to the Western Islands. And of course, it behoved Thorfinn also to have one or two trusted men at the Trondheim court, keeping an eye on the current king and making sure that any moves on Thorfinn's earldom could be countered swiftly and efficiently. That was in the days of raids and battles, murders and maimings, and a young man from Hethabir like Ketil, with no aptitude for his father's cup-making business, could see some action. But then Thorfinn killed his nephew Ronvald, and Thorfinn regretted it, and Thorfinn travelled to Rome to make his penance. And now Thorfinn, recently become the father of twin boys, was more interested in church building and settlement making and law giving and tax raising. And since he'd chosen to base this fascinating new way of life on a peninsula poking assertively into the sea off the west mainland of Orkney, Ketil knew he was going to see more of the islands over the next few years than he had ever remotely intended. Prone to fogs, windy and impractically flat compared with what Ketil thought of as his Trondheim home, the islands were not what he would have chosen for himself. He had returned with his own few men about a month ago, at the beginning of winter, and found Thorfinn's hall bright with new tapestries and Thorfinn's wife Ingebjorg smugly busy with her twin boys. Her daughter Asgarda, possibly prettier than ever with that sweep of bright blonde hair and rounding into a woman few men could pass by without at least a backward glance, was also busy, but not at all smug. All her mother's duties of overseeing hall and longhouse seemed to have fallen to her, and anyone giving her that backward glance needed to do so from a safe distance. She'd developed a handy way with a wooden spoon that seemed at least to relieve some of her impatience. Thorfinn, away from the women folk, had plans, but was not explicit about them. The first question to Ketil was an odd one. What do you know of Sigurd's farm? What do you think of it? Sigurd Harald's daughter, Ketil asked, playing for time as he made sure there was no other Sigurd. Yes, you know the place, don't you? A little, my lord, Ketil conceded. It's small, I believe, though her sheep graze quite a wide area. She's mentioned a cow and some hens. A boy called Gnup helps her. Longhouse in good condition? Thorfinn asked briskly. Smallish, I know, for a family. I've never heard her complain about it, said Ketil, wondering what this might be leading to. Thorfinn did like to organise his men. It occurred to Ketil that perhaps he had someone marked out for a husband for Sigrid. As a young widow with a farm and no family, she might seem to Thorfinn like a good match. The idea set an uneasy prickle down his spine. He should at least warn his old friend. Is there anything in particular you'd like to find out? I could go and talk with her today, my lord. Yes, do that. Some general information. Get a feel for the place. See what you think. I'm not a farmer, my lord, Ketil reminded him. Sigrid will tell you all you need to know, I'm sure. Go and see her. Send her my greetings. Tell her Ingebjorg is still delighted with the tapestries. So Ketil went, though not immediately. He'd not seen Sigrid in the couple of days since his arrival, so he thought it only courteous to take a bath in the bathhouse first, and change into a clean shirt and shave. He'd known Sigrid when they were children in Hethabir, their fathers both Norwegian merchants, but they'd not seen each other for years until he had discovered her recently, an impoverished widow in Bercy. She still treated him like a little brother in need of firm guidance, but he was fond enough of her, he supposed, enough to warn her of any plans Thorfinn might have for her future. Sigrid had other ideas. It's this stupid notion of his about taxes. She stamped ahead of him into the longhouse. She'd offered him a cup of ale and he had accepted, wondering if she had brewed it herself. Give that fire a poke, Ketil, I can't feel my fingers. Honestly, I sometimes think you men ought to find somewhere to raid again. Off you'd go for the summer and leave us in peace, and then you'd come back with enough loot to keep us going through the winter. How can I pay Thorfinn taxes from this place? It doesn't even keep me alive, not without the weaving and the nail binding and the felting and... Oh, stupid man. He sends his greetings, said Ketil mildly. The ale was unexpectedly good, and Sigrid's cat, seeking warmth, had settled hard against his side, purring. And he said to tell you that Ingebjorg is still delighted with the tapestries? Sigrid snorted. There was no love lost between her and Thorfinn's wife. Well, you can be grateful for it anyway, she told him. That barrel of ale was part of the payment. Ah, it is good, he said. She gave him a glare, but refilled his cup. So, do you want to know about the farm? She asked, resigned. Do you want to see around? There's not much to see. The house is small, big enough for me and Gnup, of course, and the animals down that end this time of the year. Thorsten made sure the roof was sound, and the door's only a few years old, but there's an awful draught in that corner there when the wind's in the wrong direction. I have one cow who's faithfully given me a calf a year, but she's going to run out of them sometime soon. And I've 10 sheep and 8 hens and a cockerel, usually. Sometimes he goes to Helga's hens for a fight. And a cat. She nodded at it. The infield for the big is parched at the top if there's no rain for 2 days, and running with water at the bottom, and all down one side if there's rain for half a morning. I've lost the occasional sheep off the cliff, but the outfield grazing's mostly all right, if wet. You have to keep an eye on the sheep's feet, check them often. The wall between the infield and the outfield needs repair 3 or 4 times a year. I think it needs widening at the base, but I've never had the people to carry more stones up to do it. There's no boat noose, there's no space for one, and I don't have a boat. But I suppose it's handy enough for the harbour. There, what do you think Thorfinn might think a fair rent for that? I have no idea, said Ketil honestly. He was eager to accept Sigurd's deduction that rent was all Thorfinn wanted from her. I suppose you can work for your rent too, Sigurd sighed. That usually means spending time with Ingeborg. But yes, when I can. I think I've done most of what she fancies at the moment, though. The new hall is half tapestried, with the rest to be done in the summer. I saw, it looks very fine. He could see her blush. Aye, well, don't look too closely at some of them. When Sheepface is at her most annoying, things don't always go the way I want them to. And I didn't always have the most skilled assistants. Anyway, she refilled his cup again. What have you been up to? Subduing the good folk of Thorfinn's earldom? Only bits of it, Ketil shook his head. A quiet autumn, just a few skirmishes. Are you here for the winter then? Yes, with my men. Your men? She made a face. I hope they're better than the last one you brought home. He was not really one of my men, Ketil said defensively. He just turned up. Aye, but you let him. He sighed. Why did they always descend into bickering? Why did she always pull him into it? He set his cup down, though it was still half full. I'd better get back to them. Obviously, you think they need close supervision. How many of them? 3. Scorri, Geirrod, and Alf. She shrugged. I'll keep an eye out for them. I'll keep them busy. Thank you for the ale. He rose easily from the bench where he had been perched and towered over her, as he would have done since he was 14 if he'd seen her then. He could not resist adding, no doubt Thorfinn will be in touch. I'm sure, she sniffed, arms folded. He'll probably send you back to collect his hack silver and a hen or 2. I'll see you soon. Last autumn, I went down to Duncarron medieval fort near Stirling to a Viking weekend. The organizer had tucked me into a little hut near the centre of the fort, which was a pretty good place for selling books, but just as importantly, a wonderful spot for watching the reenactment fighters practice and then actually fight. The reenactment people lived in their Viking clothes for the weekend. And let me tell you, it's a bit of a shock when a Ford Fiesta draws up and a Viking warrior steps out of the front passenger seat. I mean, at the very least, you'd expect him to be driving. It was also interesting to note that a sizable proportion of Viking warriors wear glasses and smoke rollies. And a Viking warrior in a helmet and a surgical face mask is a very unnerving sight. But aside from that, I was able to watch them sharpening their blades, sorting out their chainmail, arranging their gloves and head protection, and then exercising and staging their mock fights, which was really interesting, an experience I really valued when I wrote this bit of the new book. Now, the new book, and only my cover illustrator and I know this until this moment, is to be called The Bear at Midnight. And here for the first time in public, although possibly back to front, is the cover, with indeed a bear, because I am always challenging my poor cover illustrator to do new animals.
Awesome, that looks great.
I think she thinks I own a zoo. I only have one cat now. Anyway, the new book begins with the death of Einar Einarsson, who was in charge of the hall at Bugqui, just to the shore side of Bercy. The appointment of his replacement lies with Thorfinn, but there are several candidates. There's a useless local lad called Foldar, Einar's nephew Varin, supported by his brother Sigvat, and the bear, Bjorn, who is Einar's son, but he's been living in Norway. And funnily enough, he's actually been a hostage in Norway. And I think hostages have also been touched on this week. So it's all very, it's all winding in very nicely from my perspective. Thorfinn decides to set up a few mock battles to test the candidate's strength and battle tactics. And he faces Bjorn and his ship's crew up against the locals led by Varin, and a few of Thorfinn's men help out. Of course, the older men and the women folk come out to watch. And the women have the additional task of patching up the injured and bringing them ale. Women have to make themselves useful after all. So Vikings, when not raiding, spent a great deal of time in mock fighting and in competitive sports like swimming and skiing in order to keep themselves fit for all that raiding and pillaging in the summer months. Einar's herd have not raided for a few years now, and many of them are a bit past it. Just noticed somebody in the waiting room.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'll see if I can check that.
Sorry. Einar's herd haven't raided for a few years now, and many of them are definitely past it. Bjorn's men, by contrast, have been keeping themselves busy harrying the Danish coast, so they're well ready for a fight. So here we are, watching with Sigrid as the two sides prepare to knock 7 bells out of each other, which I suspect is not a Viking expression. It was half exercise, half competitive. But with Thorphin watching closely and 2 or more candidates for the hall involved, the competitive half was likely to dominate. Sigrid guessed that the 2 opposing lines did not arrange themselves opposite one another so tidily in a real battle. Thorphin, who chose to oversee the event on foot, examined both sides closely before backing clear and giving the signal to attack. Bjorn's men instantly ran hard at the locals, smashed through the shield wall in seconds, and flattened 3 or 4 of the men, gently enough, just to show that they had won. Thorfinn sighed and shouted for a retreat. "Well done, Bjorn," he called, the element of surprise. He looked across at Varin, but Varin and Sigvat were in urgent conversation. Sigvat waved over a few of Thorfinn's men as well as, Sigrid noticed, some of the Buckquee herd. Odder's son, Foldar, was amongst them. At the back of the locals, she saw Ketil standing with his sword drawn, looking, if anything, quite detached from what was happening. Scorry, his man, spat on the sandy ground, and Alf weighed a spear in his hand, as if trying to determine its quality before buying. "Are we quite ready?" asked Thorfinn, a little tartly. Sigvat looked at Varin and muttered something. Varin nodded. "Aye, my lord," he said. Thorfinn gave the signal. Bjorn was not foolish enough to use the same tactic twice in a row. This time his men advanced more slowly, edging across the practice ground as the locals tensed behind their shield wall. Sigrid saw that each of the front shield bearers had braced themselves with a long leg to the back, their bodies turned almost sideways to present a harder target. But Bjorn's men had their spears low, aiming for the vulnerable points of the wall where the round shields no longer overlapped and the thighs of their opponents were less well protected. After a moment of unbearable tension, Bjorn's men charged again, and once the long weapons had done their work, the long-handled axes came out, prizing the remaining shields from the hands of their owners or reaching helmets and shoulders over the top of them. But this time the local men were fighting back. Huge Afi used his shield as a battering ram in the centre of the line, and followed by Sigvat and Foldar, the latter's face already running with blood, they ploughed through the front rank of Bjorn's men, trampling 2 or 3 underfoot. The rest of the locals who were still standing followed, a wedge that broke Bjorn's little army in 2 and scattered the men. The wedge split and the locals were fighting confidently on 2 fronts now, back to back. Bjorn's men sagged away as Thorfinn shouted the retreat, and the locals cheered. "I'd better go and see to Foldar," said Frogan, who'd arrived unnoticed beside Sigrid. "Brother's such a responsibility." Most of the men seemed uninjured, though pleased with themselves, wiping off the blades of the axes as though they'd slaughtered dozens. Helga and Sigrid watched, in case they were needed, as Frogan put a pad of cold cloth to her brother's nose. Around them, several women were attending to cuts and bumps. Frogan returned to the safer side of the paddock wall. "He'll need that sewn later," she said. "He's not really a fighter, Foldar. I think I'd be more used to it there than he would. I might enjoy it more too." It was true that Foldar, who barely looked grown up, though he was older than Frogan, seemed a little nervy as the locals took their places again to face Bjorn's crew. A few men sat out now with those in the paddock. There had indeed been spear wounds to thighs. A few men sat out, and Geirrod, that could be very nasty, and Geirrod, nursing one hand, came to claim his dog back from Sigrid. "2 more rounds," he told them, "then there'll be some individual combat." "What have you done to your hand?" asked Helga. Geirrod made a face. "Used it to barge through Bjorn's shield wall," he said, and the dog followed him mournfully away. "I don't know why they do the big fight first," said Helga, watching him go. "Weeds out the weaklings," said Frogan, "like Foldar, bless him. They should let us out there, we'd show them." The third bout had started, and Frogan was watching with keen interest. Foldar seemed to have taken a blow to the head and was very unsteady on his feet, his face still smeared with blood. But the locals were holding their own generally. Varin seemed to be talking to the men, planning his attack, and they seemed willing enough to follow. Bjorn relied more on charging into the fray or shouting at his men as they fought, always with a huge grin on his face. It did him no good in the third bout, for Varin reversed his tactics, allowed his own shield wall to collapse in the middle, then surrounded Bjorn's men as they hurtled through. Skorri himself casually gave Bjorn a good dunt on the helmet, and Bjorn stumbled and went down with a mighty thump that jarred everyone's teeth. Thorfinn called again for the retreat, and this time Sigrid had to put aside her spinning and join Helga and Frogan in staunching and binding up wounds. The practice ground was growing messy, gouged and stained, and one of Bjorn's men had a broken leg where Afi had accidentally trodden on him. Afi carried the man gently off the field, apologizing every step of the way. For a while it looked as if Bjorn himself had broken his arm in his fall. There were a couple of other men already with arms strapped up, but after some examination it was declared that it was only bruised, and Bjorn, beaming, lifted it high to encourage his men. Varin, still uninjured, was striking a pose close to where Thorfinn had established himself, while Sigvat, his brother, moved among the locals, talking. Sigrid, tending to a fighter's calf and noticing Sigvat pass her yet again, wondered if he were too nervous to stand still. The final round was the hardest fought yet. The men were barely tiring, except a few of the older ones from Einar's herd, but Bjorn's crew wanted another win, and they were determined to get it. For a while, the din was relentless, metal on metal, grunts and shouts, feet pounding the sandy ground, and men tumbling down. Thorfinn's keen gaze seemed to be everywhere. The densely packed men could barely be distinguished from each other. It was a knot of leather and mail, blades and helmets and flailing limbs. The fight surged briefly across the practice ground towards the paddock wall, and the crowd backed away, shouting warnings, but the nearest men elbowed themselves away from the wall again. The fighters, huddled together like one great beast on its erratic track, stumbled back towards the hall. Thorfinn moved out of its path, still watching closely. Then, as if at some unheard signal, the whole thing broke apart. Men fell to the ground and others staggered off, panting, and in the middle of it, Bjorn and Varin stood, shoulders heaving, facing each other with axes in their raised hands. And Thorfinn stepped forward and called for the retreat. There we are. That's the first time I think I've read from a book I haven't actually finished writing yet. So I better stop there before I end up in complications. Thank you very much for listening.
That's very brave of you to read from work in progress. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Are we opening for questions now?
Sure. If anybody has any.
This is the point where you can unmute your mic and just go for it, or else you can also type things in the chat. Folk have said in the chat that was excellent, thank you. And earlier on it was nice cover, matches the others nicely. I can start if while people are thinking of questions. I have a question. That was Vikings they lend themselves to action movies and action books. So how do you write a murder mystery book as opposed to an action book in a Viking setting?
Maybe it's because I'm better at writing murder mysteries than action books. Maybe it just happens. It's challenging, yes. I'm not sure how many plots there are going to be in it that I can actually write about. But yes, once you start looking at social customs in any society, you can see reasons why people might perhaps want to dispose of other people and not be caught doing it. There are issues, of course, with Viking law that if you did kill somebody in self-defense, as long as you reported it fairly sharpish, then you were pretty much let off, sometimes just with a fine. But if you wanted to hide, then there are lots of ways of doing that. So there's always, obviously we don't have fingerprints, which is a bit of an issue. But on the other hand, we don't have mobile phones, which is a great blessing. Writing historical stuff enables you to move slightly more slowly and allow your readers to come along at the right speed. Whereas if you write about contemporary technology, things can just whiz off and get out of hand. It's too much for my little brain writing about technology. So I prefer to stick to swords and axes and poison and hangings and nice, traditional.
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering about, that the mystery as opposed to just the killing, because there's a lot of other killing going on in Viking society all the time that aren't mysteries, but they're still killing,
Yeah.
I've got a comment here from Sheila Fisher in the chat. She says, I did the Viking week in 2019 and bought Lexie's 2 books at her talk. They are a really good read. Looking forward to getting the others.
Oh, thank you very much, Sheila. That's very kind.
And Annabelle says, lovely cover. I wonder if the runic bear's tooth will be in it. I really enjoyed your first 2 books. Annabelle's thinking of the bear's tooth from the Broch of Bercy with the runic inscription on it that says Futhark.
Yeah. Well, we'll just have to wait and see.
Do you sometimes find that you don't know what's going to happen in your book until you write it?
Yes. Yeah, it's a bit annoying. Other writers seem to have better control over their characters than I do. Mine have just legged it to Kierkegaard without asking permission. They've just ended up. And now I'm sitting there thinking at my carefully written out plot and thinking, how am I going to get them back? And what are they going to do while they're there? And yeah. So yes, I used to be a very careful plotter, and but it's sort of got out of hand now. I've lost control.
Is the bear's tooth gonna make an appearance, do you think?
I don't know. We'll have to see.
I was also wondering with Thorphin, you said Thorphin, this is a Thorphin who regrets killing his nephew Ronald. And I was thinking of that regret, and it made me think about Thorfin's grandson Håkon and his regret of killing his cousin Magnus, Saint Magnus. Is there a foreshadowing there?
Yes, yeah, that was. Yeah, I think it was very striking that Thorfinn headed off on his pilgrimage and all his diplomatic efforts. The diplomatic efforts make sense. Going to see King Harold in Norway, and then I think it was King Sweyn in Denmark. But heading off to Rome, and I always got the impression that in the old faith, there wasn't enough room for repentance. You had to be quite proud of killing somebody who was in your way, but he regretted it and he had to find a reason to regret it. And that was why he turned more to the new faith.
Wow, I like that, yeah.
Because it gave him that opportunity, that peace of mind, maybe. But yes, it does foreshadow, although obviously I'm not going to get as far as the death of St. Magnus, but yeah, very clear echoes.
Dave has said, has your research gone as far as researching Viking food? If so, what are your favorite Viking recipes? Oh, we'd all like to know this because I'm always on the lookout for recipes that we can use in our Viking feast.
You see that? I know it's back to front. It's An Early Meal by Daniel Serra and Hannah Thunberg. So yeah, I haven't made a lot from it yet, but I'm planning to make kettle worms.
Worms?
So I bet you're regretting asking now. It's basically sausages with pork and beef and what's effectively bacon and ramsons or leeks if you can't get ramsons. And then you put them in sausage casings and stew them. I'm very partial to a sausage.
That sounds tasty. I have a kind of vision of Viking food as consisting a lot of dried fish and dried meat and smoked and preserved things.
Yeah.
The recipe there sounded quite tasty.
Yes, it was quite tempting. I think a lot of flatbreads too, but then you do that in Viking hiking, don't you? We've got boar stew here. We don't get a lot of boars in Aberdeen to catch. So I think pickled turnips might be closer to my what I can actually find for myself. But they manage in this book, they actually find references to a lot of these in the sagas, and it's quite good fun. Wild leaf, herb and cheese pottage. That sounds good.
Yeah, it's very well researched, that book, and I sometimes see Daniel Serra on online forums. I'm a member of a million online forums to do in Vikings, and he always comes in and corrects people if they get too adventurous with foreign spices and things like this. And there's no evidence for that. So I think they've done a really good job in researching that book very thoroughly.
I think so. He's in a Facebook page that I go to for authentic Viking food. So yes, that's good fun. That's lots of people going out and doing reenactments and then trying to justify afterwards what they've cooked, which is good fun.
Yeah, but it's in the reenactment communities that you find answers to the how to questions, because when you try to read archaeological reports, they don't often tell you actually how to cook things or how to make things or how to wear the clothes that they wore, but reenactors have to think about all these things because they're doing them. So they are the ones who ask, well, which way did the strap go, and that kind of question.
Yeah, not that way because it hurts. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, over to you.
No, I was just reading in the messages. Dave in Edinburgh is saying they thrive mostly on mead. It's a primary food group. Well, honey is very antiseptic, so it would be very good for you, I'm sure.
I was going to read Raina's comment here. When you get that coveted Netflix streaming deal, who would you cast to play Sigrid and Ketil?
I can't answer that. I never remember the names of any actors. So I watch very little television at the moment. I'm sort of limited to the Antiques Roadshow and various countryside programs, and so I never know who anybody is. And so the best I could say is, well, I saw somebody on a poster who looked a bit as if he might be okay, but I wouldn't be able to tell you who he was. So I'm sorry, Raina. I'll have to wait for central casting to get back to me.
We'd need somebody who's tall, dark, and handsome.
Oh, he's very blonde.
Oh, Ketil, yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking of Thorphin still.
Oh, yes. No, yeah. Well, no, he wasn't supposed to be handsome, though, was he? He was supposed to be ugly. But
okay, tall, dark, and ugly. Any suggestion for that?
Yeah. No, I must say I've only started looking at the food side of things because I've looked more at the wool work, the nail binding and tablet weaving, which takes a lot of concentration. I have a little bit of nail binding somewhere. Oh, there we are. I did a very fluffy bit at the Viking festival last year. Somebody actually sat down patiently and taught me it. One very nice reader actually was so fascinated by it that she went away and taught herself properly and has done hats and things. And I just felt like saying, oh, for goodness sake, would you come and teach me how to do it? I just mentioned it, but you've gone and done the thing. So one day I will sort it out and get it into my head, because I keep doing it and then forgetting how to do it again. But yeah, I like all the weavings. Very good fun.
I was wondering if you have any tips to share for people who are interested in writing about how to get under the skin of characters, like, because I think what you do is that you take the saga, the Orkneyinga saga, where you've not got any information about people's feelings and their inner workings. It's all seen from the outside and sticks to facts, and you've transformed that to a narrative where people are much more human in a way, and they're three-dimensional people. Have you got any tips for, like, how do you make that transition?
I think the main thing I always do is invent characters in groups. Usually start with two and see how they bounce off each other and how they react to each other, what they think about each other, what they say to each other, what they hide from each other. And once you start thinking of them as people in a group, in a society, it's much easier to imagine their motivations. But I do get carried away. I mean, it was quite minor characters, and I'll have their whole backstory and then think, oh, such a waste. I mean, all they're going to do is come in and die, or, you know, sell Sigurd a comb or something like that. And and they're all there in my head, escaping usually and going to Kirkwall. But yeah, so I think that's the trouble. I over imagine them and then they escape.
Any more questions or observations in the audience here? Elizabeth says, I'm reading Tomb for an Ego just now and I'm loving it. Will be reading them all.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope you love the rest of them too.
Where can people buy them? I know they have them at the wonderful bookshop in Bercy, but where else can they buy them?
I think they are in the Bercy bookshop, actually. They're in the Orkneyinga in Broad Street in Kirkwall. They're in Blackwell's, and they are on the ubiquitous Amazon as both ebooks and paperbacks. And if you want signed copies, you can always contact our website and we'll provide signed copies. Minor characters I would consider spinning off in their own story. Tosti the priest. I like Tosti very much. And I would have had an actor in mind for him, but unfortunately he's died. And he was too tall anyway, but he was the right actor. And I can't remember his name. It's gone out of my head. Derek Fowles, who was in Yes Minister as Bernard. And he would have been a perfect Tosti. But yes, I like Tosti. He's traveled. There's a lot going on in Tosti's head. I can't think of any other characters I would spin off. Possibly Asgardr, who's my imagined daughter of Thorphin. She's gone off now. She's away out of the picture for the time being. But she's quite ferocious. I don't think she's her household would have to do exactly what she wanted, really. Otherwise, it would not be a happy life. Do I see other known areas in Orkney coming into the stories? Westry will be coming in soon. The other side, yes, Dennis, probably not Brodgar. Did I have to learn much about sailing Viking ships, or have I stuck to shore? I get very seasick. The main character in my original series, my Georgian chap, is fortunately also prone to seasickness. So although he's traveled a bit, I never really have to find out anything about ships or anything because he's just in his cabin with his head down. Catel loves sailing, and I'm just going to have to bite the bullet at some point and get out and do things. And I'm just going to be drugged up to the eyeballs. It's going to be awful, but I will have to do it. Yes. Thank you for that question. That's making me feel queasy even as I think about it.
We were talking about a little bit about Dorothy Donnett's novel King Hereafter last night, and I was just wondering, how do you see your novels and the people, Thorfinn and the people around him, in contrast to how Dorothy Donnett saw them?
I haven't read that since I was about 12, and I remember loving it at the time. And I was obsessed with Shakespeare when I was a teenager, so all I thought about that book was the Macbeth bit. I never thought of the Viking side of it at all. And it was only, I was going around St. Magnus Cathedral with my friend, and she said, and of course that's the window, and all the Dorothy Donnett fans come and look at that, and I thought, so I felt like a complete idiot. I haven't been back to read it again since, because I don't want to do it until I've finished writing this series, because I fear it might infect it. I suspect from memory that Dorothy Donnett was much kinder to Ingebjorg than I am. My Ingebjorg is horrible. And I didn't like, I thought the whole relationship between Thorfinn and Ingebjorg, I think, is a bit strange. The fact that he broke down a wall and carried her through, and she's just been milking that ever since, as far as I'm concerned. She thinks she's the greatest because Thorfinn tore her out of a burning building. So yeah, I think Dorothy Donnett was much nicer to her.
She's quite proud in Dorothy Donnett's as well, but she's very young when she first enters. She's only a teenager, and
Mm.
she's very unwilling to be married and sent out of the country to be married, and coming from a very important, well-respected Norwegian noble family, and she's more like that kind of teenager in Dorothy than it, yeah.
I think Raggie's better qualified than I am to answer the question about music. You do play a bone pipe. And we danced
music
at
figure much in Viking times? Yes, it did, but it's difficult to know very much about it. So there's musical instruments, like the one I have is panpipes, and panpipes really don't strike you as a Viking instrument when you first see it, but that one was found in York in the excavations at Coppergate, I believe, and so it really has an archaeological record, that one. It's not just a reenactor invention. You see reenactors play all sorts of instruments that they say are Viking instruments, and they are usually lyres and horns of various kinds. But most of these are medieval rather than strictly Viking age. So if we say that the Viking age goes from 793 to 1066 is usually the brackets of the Viking age in Britain, and most of these instruments that have been replicated since or reconstructed are a little bit later than that, into the Middle Ages, but have been adopted by the reenactment community. But I think it's kind of reasonable to do that, because there are some hints that Vikings might have played lyres, and one of them is actually Ronald Kali Colson. Well, he's not strictly a Viking age Viking either. He's a 12th century Norseman, but he says in a poem about himself that he can play a lyre. And going further back than that into the actual Viking age, there's poems preserved, the Edda, the Eddic poems, that could have been sung or performed. We're not quite sure if they were chanted, but in my mind it's entirely possible that they were maybe sung even. So yeah, I think music would have been an important part of people's lives. It's just that it's very difficult to preserve music and find it archaeologically.
Yeah, thank you. And would I consider writing in any other historical periods? Not Roman Britain. I think that's been done. I like to go out on a limb. And I do write Georgian, and I've also ventured into earlier Georgian, 1763. That was a bit daring. Well, you know, somebody just sowed the thought of Viking in my head, and I went for it. So I can't say no, really. You never know what is going to fire your imagination. So I'll just have to wait and see. But that'll be even more research and more books in the house, and at some point, Neolithic Britain. Oh, good gracious! Somebody's already done one. Oh gosh, what's her name? She's Orcadian, or at least she lives in Orkney. It's a young adult book.
Somebody, I think Babs Henderson, is it? She writes
No,
Neolithic
Babs
history.
Stevenson. No, it's not
Stevenson.
her. It's what's the lady's name? Hold on just a second. I might be able to find it.
But Babs writes Neolithic mysteries, doesn't she?
Oh, they're mysteries. I haven't read any of hers yet. I've got one on my.
She's a friend of mine. That's the only reason I know.
Yeah, I've
Annabelle suggests B.K. Bryce.
Yes, that's the lady. Thank you. Yeah, that's her. That's a lovely book. I think it's the beginning of a series, the one I read. Annabelle will probably know better. but yeah, that's a very, and you can see the challenges there of writing something, writing a whodunit basically so far back in history, but she does it. It's a fascinating book. It's really good. So yes, I haven't thought about doing Neolithic. I like writing. I mean, I like to see writing. So that is one of the challenges, is writing about a society where they don't generally just leave notes for each other or write each other letters, or I've found that one of the harder things, actually. There are literate people. There are people who can read Latin or write Latin. That's the ones. The Maze How Murders I've read. Yeah, that's very good. So 3. Ooh, must catch up on those ones. So yeah, I don't like mobile phones in books, but I do like letters. It does help a lot. And I think going back to the Neolithic Britain might be just a step too far for me. Ooh, Einhallo, yeah, must read that. Thank you, Annabelle.
I think it's time to wrap up our lovely author session here now. We've been going for nearly an hour. Unless anybody has any last questions or points they want to raise.
Or further information to give me. I've learned a lot this evening. That's very good.
Yes, I'll just want to finish by thanking you, Lexie. This has been great, and thank you for reading from your books, and especially the new one in progress. So yeah, those of us who haven't got the full series yet need to complete it and then go and buy book number 4. So that's great. Thank you so much for sharing all that. And folk are saying the same in the chat too. Wendy says, thank you, what an excellent session. It's gone so fast. Annabelle says, thank you, I really enjoyed tonight. And I think we all agree on that one.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been great fun.
Bye.